Chris Lee and Blake Lovell of Southeastern14.com here to preview 3 games in the SEC on Tuesday night in order of tip-off. Blake, I think we'd be generous to say this is not the best night of basketball that you'll watch all year in the SEC.
Well, we always say that, but this on paper is probably not the best matchups. But then again, we say that sometimes, and you can be surprised by this league. And point no further than the Missouri Alabama example from a couple weeks ago, and some of those. But this is you've got a main event here, but the other ones you're probably looking at the favorites and feeling pretty good about their chances. So.
Well, Alabama is, according to KenPom, a 15-point underdog going to Georgia. And we've talked repeatedly about how Georgia's favorite. Excuse me. That's right.
I was going to say, hold on a second now. If I was going to say, now here's the thing, is if Alabama plays defense the way that we've talked about in some of these other videos, I don't think they're going to be a 15-point underdog, but they better be on it, right? Because otherwise, we've talked about their defense, and we'll see. But
I'm just checking to see if people are paying attention, mostly me. The rematch of the national title game, yes. That's about as good as we can say. Look, Georgia has kept games closer than it should have, and Alabama's so erratic. 15 seems like a big number to me.
Yeah, I think so.
But maybe not to you.
Well, I also think that we've talked about Georgia's defense. Like, it's not Georgia. It's not
the Kobe Dean isn't walking through that door.
Jordan Davis, those kind of guys are not out there. So I think that's the issue here, and that's where I probably would take Alabama to win this by 15 or so. But again, I say that we've talked about it. Alabama's defense is just, there's a lot to be desired there right now with them, and I don't think Georgia's the kind of team offensively that can challenge them even against a bad defense. Because if you look at Georgia, they're kind of a team that's they scored 66 at home to Vanderbilt, and they've kind of scored in the 60s against a lot of these types of teams. So for that reason, I think there's a good chance that if Alabama gets rolling offensively, they can probably name their score in this game, because Georgia's just, they give up so many points. And I think that's the issue here for Georgia, is to be able to keep this close. They have to play the type of defensive game that, quite frankly, I haven't seen them play in a long time. And you also have to just assume that Alabama's just going to miss a lot of shots. And maybe they do, because they're not as good of a three-point shooting team as they were last year. We've said that many times. But I think Alabama wins this game by a pretty comfortable margin, and maybe that's 15 or more. Because if you look at the numbers, Alabama offensively shooting 56.5% from 2. That's 11th in the country. Georgia 325th in the country defensively against the 2-point. But Alabama's just got to shoot better from 3. And I think if they can hit some shots here early on, this is one of those early starts, 6:30 p.m. Eastern, kind of early-ish based on some of the other games. But, I think you just got to go with what you've seen. And what we've seen is Georgia's starting to be a team that's, even though we kind of pumped up, they hadn't really gotten blown out a lot this season. Well, they've lost 3 of their last 4 by 16 or more, I think it is now. So in that scenario, I think you feel pretty good about Alabama's chances here.
We're doing these on Monday morning. Lines aren't out yet, so when we cite a number, we're using KenPom, which is usually pretty close. And speaking to that, the number on Auburn is minus 14 at Missouri. That one an 8:30 Eastern start. Not a game we expect to be particularly interesting, but with Missouri, they will jump up and surprise you at times, as Alabama has discovered.
I tell you, this is going to come as a surprise perhaps, but this is one of those games that you look at. And again, we're assuming, and we're recording this Monday morning, which, we've got our other video up to, reaction from the weekend of Auburn, Kentucky, but we're assuming that Auburn's going to be the number 1 team in the country at this point. And maybe they're not. Maybe they're number 2 again. But still, either way, it's a huge game for Missouri because they have beaten Alabama at home. They played well against Alabama, like we talked about. They lost that game by 10, but they played pretty well in that game. They just beat Ole Miss by 25 on the road. Missouri's playing better. And because they are at home, if this was on the road, you'd feel completely different probably about this game. But I look Auburn's gonna. I'm not gonna pick against Auburn here. There's a reason why. Again, they may be the number one team in the country after we finish talking about this. But Konzo is just one of those coaches. We've said it. I mean, it's just like defensively, he will probably figure some things out to try to, be able to combat this Auburn team. But maybe I'm just reading too much into this. But I think when you look at the potential letdown effect, those kind of things, maybe we're playing that up too much. Auburn's the significantly better team here. But I think there's a reason why that's kind of 14 is maybe not as big as you would think it would be. Because I just think it's Missouri's playing better, and the crowd jacked up for this kind of game, and maybe early on there's a scenario where Auburn gets off to a slow start or something, and that kind of situation. But yeah, I'm obviously not going to pick against Auburn here. But that 14 or whatever it winds up being, I think that's tricky because I think this game, there's a variety of different scenarios that could play out just based on maybe what you get from Missouri in this one, whether that added motivation of playing perhaps the top team in the country, if that can kind of continue to ride what's been a pretty good wave for them recently, just because they're playing a lot better than they were.
Okay, you talk about Missouri playing better, and there's two things here. Last two games out, Missouri loses at Alabama, held a lead in part of that game, a lot of that game, led at half. The game before just demolishes Ole Miss on the road. Game before that, and this is really what I'm getting at, Missouri's not only playing better, but home it's been a different team. They lose last home game 67-64 to a pretty decent Texas A&M team. Home game before that, it's beating Alabama. And home game before that is knocking off Utah. And then before that, Eastern Illinois. Now we're getting into it doesn't matter territory. But the point is, Missouri's played pretty well at home for a while now.
Yeah, and that's why I think it's, again, if you're looking at it, that number is probably deceiving to you because you're like, wait a second, it's only 14. You maybe have the number one team versus a team that's just not been great. But that, I think, is the reason, is they play much better at home for the most part. And I just think Konzo's a good defensive coach. We've always talked about that. And I think maybe he can figure some things out here to force Auburn to, certainly try to take more shots from outside than letting, Kessler, Jabari Smith, those guys do what they want. So, yeah, I mean, and again, maybe we're playing this up way too much, but that's what we do. We have to be able to try to dissect these games, right? And this is one where on paper it probably doesn't look like much of a game, but I think if you dig a little bit deeper, you can see a path for Missouri to make this interesting. But do I think Missouri's going to win? Obviously, that's a hard thing to predict just based on how good Auburn has been to this point.
Okay, Mississippi State going to Kentucky, which should be the most interesting game of these three. I'm not convinced it will be. That game is 9 o'clock Eastern. First of all, let's hit this. Does a 9 o'clock Eastern tip-off affect the team, either one? I mean, that's late for everybody, right?
I don't think so. I think if anything, I think that's a better scenario than, like I mentioned, Alabama playing at 5:30 Central. I think those are better scenarios in my opinion, to play the later game versus the earlier game. So no, I don't think so. But I do think this is interesting because, as we said, we don't know right now if TyTy Washington's going to play. We saw it. I mean, that's a big part of Kentucky, and he's a big part of what they do. And you've got Iverson Molinar on the other side. You and I talked about it. Shaquille Moore's played well for Mississippi State. That's a pretty good guard group for the Bulldogs, and I think that's where this game can be interesting from that perspective. Is if you can, kind of have those guys. Molinar, we've always said, is one of the best players in the league and doesn't get enough credit for it. But Mississippi State's they're a balanced group, and we've kept talking about. I mean, we keep talking about that. Like, they've got Tolu Smith in there, who's 6'11", and maybe there's a way for him to match, what Sheboy can do, and maybe kind of slow him down a little bit. But then you've got also like a guy like Garrison Brooks, who's 6'9", 230, and Mississippi State to me is the kind of team that can match up okay with Kentucky. But the issue I have with Mississippi State is, and you know where I'm going on this. They played two true road games this year, and they haven't looked great in either one of them.
Nope.
They lost by 10 at Ole Miss. They lost to a Colin Castleton-less Florida team by 8 on the road recently. That is my issue with feeling good about Mississippi State's chances to win this game. Do I think they can keep it close? I do, because I also think there's that potential hangover effect for Kentucky from losing that game against Auburn. And again, to me, there are too many questions to know for sure, because I think if Ty Washington plays, it's much different than if he doesn't, because that's where, like we said, you've got one of the best guards in the league, one of the best players in the league, and Iverson Molinar on the other side. So I think that's where the question comes in.
I was bigger on State last year than you were, and you just kept saying, there's something there I don't like about them I can't put my finger on. And I look at them this year a little bit the same way. I kind of feel like, tell me if I'm crazy, but I kind of feel like the whole is less than the sum of the parts. I mean, they've got a great guard in Molinar. We've talked about Shaquille Moore. They've got Rocket Watts off the bench. They've got Garrison Brooks, who transferred at North Carolina, had a really good season for the Tar Heels 2 years ago. They've got Toulouse Smith, who's a good big. He's been hurt at times. I just feel like this team has more talent than the performance, which they're 44 in KenPom this morning. I mean, to me, this is a top 25 team on talent, and for whatever reason, it just hadn't fit together. Maybe I'm not seeing that right, but I'm starting to pick up on whatever intangible thing it was about them. Now, having said this, maybe they turn it around and become the team I think they can be, but there's just a little something about them that bothers me that I've not put my finger on.
Well, and you just said what Mississippi State fans have been saying for a long time now, is there have been many times probably where they feel like they've had the talent to be a top 25 team, but when you look back in this era, the Ben Howland era,
not a lot to show for it.
They've had one team to support that, and that was the team that got to the tournament and lost to Liberty in the first round. So I think that's it. Like they've never really been a bad team, but they've also never really hit that elite level that I think you would want them to hit at times, and maybe you think they should be able to hit at times. And my expectation was not. I don't think that I thought this team was going to be able to do that. I said I thought that they're the sleeper team if you wanted to find one earlier in the season, but just because they were being picked in that 7 to 8 range or whatever. But I still think that, aside from everything I've talked about, how I don't think they are just a terrible team in really any area, they're also not really, an elite team in many areas. And that's where, that those can be the things that can kind of hold you back. But I think the biggest thing here is, does Mississippi State have the potential to win this game? Yes. But you're probably not confident about that, just because Kentucky is a better team overall, and Kentucky has proven that they can play to that level overall. So I think in this one, I mean, we're looking at KenPom, right? Like I said, we're guessing the number here, but KenPom's got 11. If it's that 10 to 12 range, I probably think Mississippi State keeps it within that. I'd probably take Mississippi State plus the 12 or whatever it is, just because I think they are good enough to have a chance to be in this game and maybe, be right there with a couple minutes to go. But at the same time, those road issues really are a problem for me with Mississippi State, because this will be their third true road game of the season, and they've lost the other two and not played great in them. So I take Mississippi State plus the 11 or 12 if that winds up being that. But otherwise, I think just, Kentucky should win this game.
Let me ask you for, I think, an important point of clarification. Is that assuming Washington is playing in 100%? Is that assuming he doesn't play?
Obviously, if he doesn't play, you feel a lot more confident about that. But I think even if he does play, I think Mississippi State's a team that can match up decent with Kentucky. Just from so I'm gonna say either way. Either way, I think Mississippi State either way is gonna, because look, we have to think about this too. Mississippi State's lost 5 games this season. Where have they been blown out? They've got one loss by 14 points. Everything else has been in that 10 or less, right? So, Minnesota by 5, Colorado State by 3, Ole Miss by 10, Florida by 8. So it's not like they've been close in a lot of. I mean, again, we always say this with different teams, but 2 or 3 different plays go, a different direction. We're looking at Mississippi State right now as a 15-3 team or 16-2, but
which would be ranked. Yeah.
Yeah, and so either way, I think I like Mississippi State to make this interesting. And maybe this is like that final point, right? Where it's like, if they don't make it interesting here and they come out and lose this game by 15 or 20, then I think you got a lot of people jumping off that Mississippi State as the sleeper bandwagon. Or, there's just not a lot of people probably having that confidence if they don't come out and at least have a chance to make this thing somewhat intriguing, which I think they can.
Well, to your point, and look, these were different teams last year, as is the case in college basketball. State had DJ Stewart, who's not with them anymore, but has added some really good players. Kentucky didn't have Sheboy or Washington or Wheeler or Kellen Grady for that matter, but had some of the other parts were there. State lost a double overtime game to Kentucky last year on January the 2nd, and then beat Kentucky in the first round of the tournament. So if you're a believer in sometimes teams just match up well with others for whatever reason, maybe there's something there.
Yep, I think that's the scenario here, and we'll see. A lot depends on, I think, if Ty Washington plays. If he doesn't, I think Mississippi State's got a shot here. If he does, that makes it obviously much tougher.
Any parting thoughts?
Nope. We've got our Action 24/7 partnership. Just look in the description below. We've got the link to that. To use the code South14. If you sign up, your first deposit, they'll match up to $800. So just use the link in the description below. South14 is the code, and check that out.
Thanks for watching. If you are watching and haven't subscribed, please do that. It helps us out. Also, if you're a sponsor interested, let us know too. You can reach out and contact us. Chris.Lee@southeastern14.com. He's Blake Lovell. I'm Chris Lee. We will see you again on Tuesday with previews for Wednesday.